Okay, hi everyone. I see people are joining us. We'll just wait a few minutes or so until we have more people and then we'll get started. Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I think let's just get started and then more people can join. My name is Rachel Adams. I am the Chief Curator and Director of Programs at the Bemis Center in Omaha, Nebraska. Thank you for joining us for Between Two Screens, a conversation with Paul Mpagi Sepuya. This is coinciding with an exhibition that we have up right now of Paul's work, along with two other exhibitions, one with Joey Farso, one with Maria Antelman. These shows are sort of curated under the rubric of intimate actions, and those are on view until April 24th, which is really exciting that we were able to extend them. So if you are in the Omaha area, please schedule a visit to come down and see the shows. We'd love you to chat in to the chat. Tell us where you're joining us from today. There will be time for questions as well. So just make sure to chat those in if you have any. I just wanted to quickly thank our sponsors of the exhibition, as well as let everyone know that we do have an upcoming program tomorrow night. Our Live at Low End with Jan Novak starts at 8 p.m. and you can view that on our Twitch channel. And then next week, we are starting a series of conversations titled Public Assembly that will be centered around the three exhibitions. The first one is on February 8th, I believe. I hope, starting at 6 p.m. You can register for those on our website. They're going to be facilitated conversations by Omaha-based artists, Dewan Lamont Hayes and Nathaniel Rouleau. So please join us for that. It'll be really interesting conversations about the exhibitions. Today we are here for a conversation with Paul. Thank you so much, Paul, for joining us today. Paul is joining us from Los Angeles. We are going to show some work. I'm going to show some installation views of Drop Scene, which is the show that's on view right now at Bemis, just so everybody is familiar with the works that are in the show. And then Paul will switch and share his screen and go through a variety of slides that he's put together to kind of give everybody some more context about his work. We'll take questions as, if they come in, and I'll sort of pepper those through the talk. But yeah, please let us know, and we'll be chatting a bunch of links as well that are, as we start continuing to talk about the work. So, okay. I was really excited to invite Paul to show at Bemis. I had seen his work many times over the years, and especially went to St. Louis. I feel like that was 2 summers ago now, the Contemporary Art Museum in St. Louis, where he had a large survey of his work. And that show traveled to the Blaffer Museum in Houston. And it also, from that exhibition came a really wonderful book that Aperture put together. So if people are interested in delving more into Paul's work, that's a really great book to get, and a really wonderful organization to support. That show especially really got me thinking about Paul's work a lot, about everything that he's sort of been doing. And it was really exciting that I was able to invite him to show at Bemis. And this is your first time showing in the state of Nebraska, I think, right, Paul?
Yeah.
So
I can't tell if people can see me or hear me right now. I'm seeing your screen.
I can hear you and see you, so okay. I think everybody else can. Okay. So that's good. But so this is this is the sort of entrance to the exhibition. We have works that range from, I believe, 2017 through early 2020, maybe 2019. 3 different bodies of work are in here. And if you're unfamiliar with Paul's work, Paul is obviously a photographer, works primarily in his studio, photographing in his studio. He invites people to join him into these photographs. And so you'll sort of see a range of people that are friends and acquaintances and, other artists as well, just sort of people from your general community that you've been photographing for a long time. Some of them recur throughout your work over time. And really thinking about the space of the studio, the body in the studio, blackness in the studio, what that sort of is entailing throughout these photographs. So here are just some installation views at Bemis. And you can also, sort of see that the camera plays a huge role in these works. Paul is photographing into a mirror, in front of a mirror. So what you're seeing is being reflected back to you. There's no, as he's said to me, trickery in any of these, right? It is what you see. And when you get up close to these works, especially you can sort of see it in this one on the left, you sort of start to see the remnants of like dust and smudge and things, that have kind of adhered themselves to the surface of the mirror. And in that sort of plays with, again, like space and the sort of, I think like area that's sort of happening between the actual camera and the subject, and how that sort of shows up throughout the various works. So here are some more detail images of works in the show. And then, what I think is really interesting and really great about our show is that it really has a range of scale of work. Some of these are very, very large works, where the body really is like, I think like 1-to-1 in sense of like when you're standing in front of these, you really, you're like, oh, this person is human scaled, as opposed to some of these smaller ones that are really, sort of intimate views. I mean, they're all intimate views, and that's sort of something that, all 3 exhibitions are really looking at the body and space and intimacy, which is obviously very interesting at this time of COVID when we're all sort of craving, these relationships and these touch points. And I just actually listened to this artist, Eliza Nisenbaum, yesterday talk about painting during this time. And one of her subjects had said, he was a healthcare worker. He said he actually started laying down on different surfaces of things in his house during the first few months of COVID because he wasn't allowed to touch anybody. So he just wanted his skin to feel different sensations. And I thought that was so interesting, and like poignant, and also like very like obviously like upsetting to think that, obviously some of these people that are putting their lives at risk, needing to do things like that in order to sort of feel human again in a way. Anyway, I'm just sort of thinking about that a little bit as I go through these, but really thinking about these relationships that we have and shared space in a way. Your studio, an artist studio, sometimes I think, my husband is an artist, so I know this is sort of like this kind of sacred space, right? It's like your space that you can go in and close the door and do whatever you want and play and make work and all of these things. And you really open it up. You open it up to everybody, right? You open it up to your friends and the people that you're working with in terms of who you're photographing, but you're also opening it up to us, and letting us in a way that is very different than the sort of typical studio photograph, thinking about like back then when you would go and there'd be a backdrop and, you wouldn't see anything else. And here you're really letting us in, again, in an intimate way. There's things that get repeated. There's work prints that are up. What I really loved about putting together this exhibition and, the sort of flow of it is that things really lead into each other, especially in this corner with these 2 works. It's one of my favorite moments where you sort of see the work in the studio photograph and then you see the actual finished work right next to it and sort of the crossover that's happening there, and all of those really special details. And then this part of the show, which we, suggestion from Sybil at Document, your gallery in Chicago, to paint the walls, and it really does, alter things in a really nice way. And I was very happy with how this room turned out, because it does sort of, the work is smaller scaled. There's again repetition of yourself and this person, these two people right in front of us, but then also just sort of like, we had already made this kind of small room to accommodate these works and to have this moment, and the wall color change, I think, really like adds to that. So those are just a quick overview for everybody. Did you want to say anything about that, Paul, or before we start going into your work?
I think I'll touch on a lot of what you brought up. So what you shared will be really helpful ahead of my presentation. Okay. And then I guess maybe we can just open it up to, after I go through, we can just open it up to questions.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. So if you want to start sharing, and just so everybody knows, I asked Paul, to maybe go through some influences. So he's going to show that as well. So I think that'll be really great for everybody to sort of see people that and work that he's been inspired by himself. So
So I guess I'll say that one of the starting points for this show that that Rachel pulled together with wonderful help from particularly Document in Chicago and Vielmetter here in Los Angeles, was one of the formations of it was this project, a recent project called A Conversation Around Pictures. A part of that was on view in Los Angeles back in March last year, the day that quarantine started. So the show got installed and then was entombed in limbo for 5 months. But I want to start, just kind of give that kind of context, because this one image in the show called Model Study, and actually, sorry, I'm realizing I have the wrong date on here. This is actually from 2017, was kind of the kernel of this show that brought like many years of types of images together. So to just kind of describe this image, it's a portrait. It was originally an outtake that I sat with for several years. There was a formal portrait made of my friend Yasser. And this thing that has kind of happened, and I'm going to get to it also towards the end of thinking about and what Rachel brought up as the studio itself as this kind of stage. This was an outtake kind of in between me setting up, figuring out another image to make, where he pulled out his cell phone to take a selfie. And I was really interested in the way in which my images have tended to kind of create this. What they do is they create this space that on the one hand is presenting a scene for the viewer, but in fact, because of the way that the mirror image is structured, they're in fact sort of like hermetically sealed. And I was really interested in the way in which these selfies, this like image made for immediate distribution on Instagram or whatever apps and things, kind of has this, it's allowed to circulate in the world in another way. So a lot of what you see happening in the drop scene exhibition here is this both kind of like or almost sort of like side by side spheres of kind of like an internal intimate space, but also an awareness and an engagement with the stage of photography. And so I'll start off with some references to kind of like take it back, because one of the main projects in here, and a lot of the work is around this language of the dark room. So here's a picture that I show in a lot of artist talks. It's just a traditional photographer's dark room. Or I guess now it's like is it antiquated? I don't know. Everything's digital.
I think it's antiquated now, but I miss this. This is like my high school and college years were spent here,
Yeah, and so I think about it because of thinking about my initial introduction to photography, which was through analog process, and thinking about the ways in which darkness, or there's the photographer who learns the medium in an analog black and white dark room has to develop a type of visual sensitivity and touch around being able to produce an image in conditions of this kind of like skewed darkness that but with an awareness of how the image will be eventually displayed or seen in the outside world. But this sort of initial viewing experience through this like mediated darkness is not something that the viewer in an exhibition or a book or something is going to have. And so what I'm thinking about this is also kind of like how it relates to the social space of the darkroom. This is a photograph of another darkroom, this is a sex spa sauna thing in called Brighton Sauna. I just found this one, both of these images I just found on the internet, but also thinking about the ways of the overlap in this language of the darkroom, where there is this space where communities, people come together, often historically marginalized, where there are these initial, again, encounters, these initial comings together, but then people have to negotiate these in the light of the broader world, but I'm really interested in the space where these formations happen. And I can talk more about that later. I hope that sort of makes sense. But what I kind of like pull that to next is this, is something that's been really one of the most influential things for me, which is this one issue zine, I guess you'd say, called Fire, devoted to younger Negro artists from 1926. And in this, it was published by a very well-known group of artists, writers in the Harlem Renaissance, including Zora Neale Hurston. But it includes a text which is the sort of the first publicly acknowledged writing by a Black queer writer in the US named Richard Bruce Nugent. But also, I love that the cover for this also kind of echoes this visual language of the dark room, this sort of like positive negative space, the modernism. We have the overlay of, you can see this profile, this modernist African profile body, the Sphinx, like the ways in which it's just such a beautiful image. There's a story in there called Lily's Smoke and Jade by Bruce Nugent. This is a portrait of him about a decade later in 1936 by Carl van Vechten. I'm not going to get into the whole story of Carl van Vechten, but anyone who's interested in the history of photography and the complications around, oh God, so many things. Van Vechten is that person I think about. He was a wealthy white benefactor of a lot of Black artists, dancers, poets, singers, etc. And he used, but the thing that I'm interested in is he used his studio as a way not only to, in a sense, collect people, but also thinking about the way in which it became a platform for sort of a almost kind of creepy negotiation of his own kind of like racialized sort of like desires. Anyways, Van Vechten there. Another influence that's been really important to me is actually Virginia Woolf. I was thinking about showing, I ended up not including a body of work that was made around this book, Orlando, but it's something that I've kind of returned to, like Bruce Nugent, for the last, gosh, almost 2 decades or more. Particularly thinking about, through this modernist text, how a medium is used and transformed, and sort of in a way to where form and the use of the medium corresponds to a type of negotiation of complicated, dynamic real world relationships. That's kind of like the briefest way I can sort of put it. The subject of the photograph that we see here on the right, Vita Sackville West, is transformed into Orlando by Woolf. Vita was a dear friend and former lover. One of the things I'm interested about the photographs is they are a kind of way of where we see the process of making the process of making work as a kind of doubling the layering and the sort of like everything on the subject. I love it. Again, I can talk more about that if there are questions. And then Truman Capote, which sometimes, people are like, what? That comes out of totally left field. But what I'm going to show after this is some images, some early work of mine in social context of the internet. And so I'll actually go to this next image of Capote's. So a lot of my early work, it coincided with the beginning of Friendster and MySpace. Eventually, once iPhones come in, we have countless apps, but even before then, it's like there's a way there's this way in which when technology or media platforms shift, there's this idea of like everything is we're confronting something that is new. But what was important for me in looking back to Capote, and I should give a context for this image, this was a promotion for his first book. He, at a time when it was not custom at all for an author to have a portrait of himself on a dust jacket, Capote had used newspapers, magazines like Life magazine, and other sort of platforms and understanding his proximity to other well-known artists to produce a public persona that preceded any actual work or like, fully formed work that he made. One way to think about it is like he was the one who knew how you just sort of like fill up a profile with a lot of alluring images before you like release the album or before,
Mm-hmm.
And so this is something that I found really interesting. And I'll once I start showing some of my work, I hope it'll make a little bit more sense. And so when this image was made, it was, it's described in by an art historian sort of as like the culmination of like a whole campaign of self-promotion and seduction. And it actually becomes sort of something that leads him into the world. It always sort of preceded him. And I find that this is particularly something that happens in sort of like a social economy that is both a social and a particularly homoerotic economy of portraiture through channels of media. Another reference is this is an image from a project of Jean Weisinger, who I believe this is actually from 1981. I'm sorry, I don't have the date here. It's a work called Seeing Myself Through Alice Walker's Eyes. Weisinger was doing a body of work wanting to document other gay and bisexual women, I guess you'd say queer women, and at a moment when she set out to make this work to visualize a community where she didn't have access in the way that we do now to visualizing her community. So anyways, the reason why I include this in here is because something that I'm also interested in is these different mediums coming together. So she describes in this work when she asked Alice Walker to be a part of this project, Walker sort of flipped the script and asked to make an image of her in response. And so we don't typically think of Alice Walker as having a role in photography, right? We know her writing, but Weisinger talks about part of making images is also corresponding to being seen and being present. And so to have Alice Walker make an image of her and to be seen by Alice Walker is what allowed her to continue and really sort of like strengthened her resolve to make this work. So again, like the work with Wolf, it's like where photography and literature and this idea of this sort of mutual entanglement, I think is really beautiful. Okay, I should start going more quicker with my references.
That's okay. It's so interesting. And I was just thinking, about that Alice Walker Weisinger piece about, your own relationship with some of the people that you're working with in your studio and how that, we can talk about it more, but paves the way for that.
It's a lot of work alongside other artists and stuff. Yeah. So I'll just skip, we've already talked about Van Vechten. Here's just another image of an artist, a dancer, Archie Savage, thinking about George Platt Lanz and Mapplethorpe, just all of these 20th century photographers and the ways in which like particularly racialized and sexualized content kind of the way it uses, and kind of like sits alongside other forms, like for example, in this case, like modernism or surrealism, as a way of kind of like putting a framework around work that otherwise might just be um, veered towards the pornographic. Thinking about, particularly someone like Rotimi Fani-Kayode being able to respond directly as a contemporary and as, an artist in his own right to, very domineering and manipulative work like that of Mapplethorpe. I think about this image directly responding to that, taking the camera and pointing it back at. I say Mapplethorpe casts a long shadow, and we're still stuck in that. But Rotimi points us to a way out. And then Larry Rivers, again, it's like, okay, a painter, but and Rivers is a really complicated character, but something that I find really interesting about his work, this is a detail of a large scale painting from 56 called The Studio, is and here's sort of like the full canvas, is the role that art plays in kind of coding, but also delivering a type of unsanctioned knowledge. Like this work is talked about in reference to gossip, and being able to sort of like reveal those sort of like illicit sort of like social and creative relationships that are happening in the New York City art world, but they're sort of translated into this type of painting. For example, here, this work very much corresponds to this affair that Rivers and Frank O'Hara were sort of having at this moment, where it was very complicated because O'Hara was the curator of painting and drawing at MoMA, and the ways in which Rivers sort of like disclosed this information was quite scandalous at the time. There's a very well-known portrait of O'Hara nude, save for a pair of lace-up workers' boots, that was displayed on the Upper East Side, several blocks from his place of employment. So anyways, all of these things that I'm thinking about, and then again, that type of collage that's happening in Rivers's work, it's, I think, really built upon in the practice of Lyle Ashton Harris in these really amazing installations that he does. And something that I really admire about Harris's work is he constantly, and this is something that I've been inspired by, pulls from visual culture, his whether it is print media, news, things like that, but also his own practice and his own archive in a way that allows them to kind of be continually layered. And I think about this particularly in the ways in which, some works may go out into the world and sort of be complete, but you can see, I mean, for if someone really sort of like knows his work, you'll see images that kind of where he's taking them from various other projects, but they're always within his reach, and he can always bring them back and reincorporate them into new forms. Okay, so that's the references. Rachel, feel free to like jump in if you're like,
yeah,
to keep me going on time, or if you want to like redirect a question.
Okay.
But getting back to this thing about the social economy of portraits, I'm not going to show the specific, a lot of specific works, but I just wanted to kind of give an example. This was from some press thing. I think it was like New York Magazine in the mid 2000s, just to give a context of like where this early work sat alongside. It was like in the queer zine world, right? So there was this thing that was happening. I was making these initial portraits in like 2005, 2004 to 2008, 7, 8, so to speak. And I set out to make something that for me was very sort of like intimately connected to people that I knew in a particular place in a particular time, but they traveled in a way that I had not anticipated. What these next 3 images are is actually, I think I've only shown them once in an artist talk before, but I did this project years later in 2013, tracking down where my images had traveled on Tumblrs specifically. And so it was this thing where I liked the ways in which they were put into this whole other kind of like context. This was spurred, and I'd kind of done this for many years, and I never knew what to make of this. But it happened after like a friend who's also an art critic, Vince Aletti, started alerting me to him encountering my work in all of these various contexts, whether there's something humorous like this ice cream brownie or something, and then like
Okay.
this, this nude Fitzroy, or to the more sort of like pornographic, um, this is something that I've always that I'm keeping in mind, particularly thinking about that first image I showed of the selfie being taken behind the scenes, and the ways in which that travels at a speed very different than the work that appears on the walls. This is an image of my own that kind of brings together this idea of the references. I'll just kind of move forward just to keep us going. Here are some other past works that all kind of like feed into. I'm showing this. This is an excerpt from one of the zines. Thinking about this way in which I wanted to bring the ways in which like um, uh, sort of like ephemeral material, like laser prints, like work test prints, like scraps and things like this come together to really introduce the idea of the studio, but
Mhm.
also the ways in which a single photograph might hold together lots of different contexts and time periods. So these are made at the Studio Museum during residency in 2010 to 2011. And this is where the studio became a place to kind of like hold a lot of material. And what that was less this idea of the studio being a place where work was finished, but where things were gathered, images were made, and the finished work might come later. But what that leads to is, again, this sort of return to laser printing out zines, et cetera. This is sort of like a draft of a book that I made for that residency in progress. But what that turns into is, for the next few years, I was working without a studio. And this is what leads to the return to the studio and the mirror work, because I was working with just whatever methods of printing that I could access, whether that was just a copier at work, or, various sort of like DIY methods. I began photographing material as it just sort of like lay in these undefined sort of in between spaces, but also at times, laying them out in these sort of across, walls when I had access to them, and rephotographing them. And what all this material really existed as was just bundles and bundles of material, as like bankers boxes and bankers boxes of this stuff, which eventually be, was bound into this project called Some Recent Pictures, a journal, which was first bound in 2013. Now there's 10 volumes. But I want to show these as a context, because people don't necessarily think of the relationship between artist books and this type of material with the mirror work that leads into drop scene.
Mhm.
But the way to kind of like explain that is, here we sort of see a few of the books finished with a small selection of this sort of like ephemeral material made outside of the studio. Is when it comes to reflecting the mirror was brought in as a way, as a surface onto which I could organize this unresolved material while incorporating my own reflection. Part of that was for personal reasons, just I guess the sort of psychology of like having to face something, having to resolve something while in the process of making these formal compositions. It was up to me whether or not I could stay in the picture and press the shutter, or I could set on a timer and walk away. Here we have, obviously I've left the scene, but this is where you start seeing these, this is what we're looking at, is the surface of a mirror with these fragments posted, and then the uncovered surface reflecting back. The mirror really kind of like transformed over the next few years into, really working with the tropes of the studio. So this type of drapery and stuff that I'm thinking about is referencing the not only the Carl Van Vechten's sort of like cheap fabric backdrops, but George Platt Lynes's sort of like modernist surrealism as well. I'll kind of go through these. I can come back to these if there's any questions, but just to kind of give a sense of the ways in which the mirror started to play a role in both constructing and deconstructing and complicating space. It led to these sort of collage type works, which again are not, they're not like physically sort of like finished collages. These are works, these are scraps of material that are cut and sort of like affixed to the surface of the mirror for the point of making an image, and then they come apart. But then that leads to, or were you want to say something, Rachel?
I was just thinking, as looking at those collages and thinking again, about this, how you were saying you were sort of just printing things like, as you could, you have banker's boxes of this work. And, obviously we know that with photography, it's so easy to like produce and reproduce and things like that. But sort of looking at those previous collages, with the tripod is sort of thinking about, I don't know, like not only fragmentation and collaging, but also like preciousness, there's something that happens there, that, and especially in this one where the actual body is there with the collage of the body and sort of, the like kind of unfinishedness of it, but yet that makes it feel like more, precious in a way. But then you're like, but then I just take it apart, or, like again, and I think that plays into like the work prints that you see in the bigger studio images too, of like, thinking about you actually working and tacking things up and looking at them and rephotographing them. So it's just came to my mind.
Yeah, and that was, that's something like, I teach, and I'm often talking with students about like how to make work after, when you're out in the world. Part of this was like a practical response to having to let go of like that training to make like perfect prints. And I had like, you learn to make a portfolio of like these, you spend all this time and resources getting this perfect thing. I was like, wait, in order for me to continue making work, I need to let go of that. And so that's why, I was like, okay, I can make images when I can with my, my medium format film camera. Sometimes it's just going to be with my iPhone. Sometimes it's just going to be with a DSLR when I eventually could afford one. But the way in which the image is produced was less important than gathering material. And then at times like this, when I've been able to, I can bring that in, and I can sort of like reconstitute it into something else. And so I'm really into like not having that at least within the studio, that hierarchy of one type of finish being better or more valuable than another.
I think that's really interesting, actually thinking about Joey's work that's up like right across the hall from you, because she's also sort of very prolific in the fact that she's producing a lot and treating it in this way that, it's another sort of aspect of the work. And it can, someone can lay down on it and I can, photograph them or videotape it, and then I can stick it back on the wall and I can move it around. And so that sort of, there's a commonality there.
Yeah, absolutely. Like all of the little things that you see in here, these are just printouts. Sometimes I just do like a photo dump from my iPhone and I just like print out, and like, so this just comes from, I just love photographing. Like there's just so many roses, and like, it's not like in LA, like they're just everywhere. Like they're at gas stations, they're outside of like crumbling apartment buildings, they're outside of fancy houses. And I just collect these photos of them illuminated by artificial light at night, like by headlights or like neon lights. And then, so that's what this is. These are just, pre-COVID, just the details of just like pictures taken at parties. I just love, that red line. I'm always sort of pulling that in. You see that back here as well. But all of that becomes material for the making of this space. And so, that working with the mirror led to, again, bringing the subjects of the portraits into this space, right? And thinking about the backdrop and everything. So like a work like this one, Draping, from 2016, I started thinking, well, when you make a backdrop for a portrait, you're making a space that is, you're sort of like indicating the space in front of it that's meant to be seen. The camera to the backdrop is what's meant to be seen. Behind the backdrop is what's not, is not meant to be seen. So I was like, oh, okay. By extension, you're creating a darkroom space. Like it became this space where I was like, oh, well, what happens on the other side of the curtain? What happens when the body sort of like is sort of set up in this space? For example, here, I was interested both in sort of like a confusion of how many bodies may be back here, but also the fact that there's a mirror into which there is a scene composed where the resulting viewer of the photograph cannot see. Or an image like this of having the, you know, this sort of like this where Nikki is like literally sort of like rolling sort of forward, but this one is also, I'm thinking about the whole Manet thing, you know, sort of as well going on. But again, this really working with the backdrop as sort of like a prop and staging, or here this kind of like confusion of space of like this you know, it's like, where is everything actually happening in this image? This partial reflection of me, I'm actually behind what we can see. This is sort of like reflecting, you know, Oscar is facing this black curtain, so he can't see me, but through this revealing here, you can sort of catch me behind the camera.
Yeah.
But what that led to was, and this is where you were talking about the smudges on the mirror, and people often see the work and they're like, are these pictures dirty or something? But when I was making those first mirror works, I realized I needed to stop cleaning the mirror's surface because I didn't want it to just disappear into nothing. I wanted, the more you looked at it, for it to reveal like, oh, this is a surface. This is a mirror. I'm actually looking at the picture I'm actually looking at the camera that's making the picture. So I left them there and I started constructing dark cloths around the mirror in my studio as a way, because I realized in order for the smudges and things to become visible, they're like obliterated against white walls when they reflect white walls. And I started thinking about the interesting, just like the potential of thinking about, oh, well, there's a certain type of latent information that requires blackness, black material, or a black subject or a black object to become visible. And it's just like such a beautiful thought. And so I started using I started collecting these brown and black velvets that I could sort of merge into, constructing a dark cloth over the mirror, putting my camera inside as a way to try to photograph the surface. And that leads to sort of me going completely inside of that space. And this is what opens up into the work that we see on view in our show together at Bemis. I was making images like these of using myself and the material as a way of making the smudges and traces visible. And that's all just the stuff resulting from my hands on the surface of the mirror as I'm collaging, or if a friend is in the studio, that might be like a smudge from someone's, you know, arm or back. And then literally what happened is my friend Evan was in town and I was showing him these images and he didn't understand how I did it. And he was like, well, can I be in one? And I was like, no, no. But then I was like, okay, well, I'll show you. And then this was one image that resulted, and it just opened up everything. I was like, oh, there's not only the possibility of thinking of blackness and material in a type of way, but also bringing in all of the language of the darkroom. So going back to that first image, right? It's thinking about the dark cloth, thinking about the backdrop and drapery, thinking about the darkroom as the space for making where through darkness, through blackness, it allows for a type of visibility, but also bringing in the social playfulness of the queer darkroom. And so that's where all of this comes from. And so this is all work from about 2017 to 2018, 19. I'm still, this is still kind of like ongoing. And then what happens is, and we were talking about the fact that there's this involvement of a lot of other artists, a lot of other people who are making images, and this leads into this idea of like these entangled cameras. So alongside, these, and I have many of these outtakes of people photographing themselves with their phones, but even with the traditional portraits, there's always this reflexive like thing of and so I'm including this image, a sitting where Nihir is making a portrait of me as I'm making a portrait of him. But this led into, in working with the Darkroom series, having friends who are photographers who have relationships with photography to bring their cameras in and us making work side by side. So that's what we see in these here.
Yeah, and
And
I love the sort of idea of this, like, these collaborative works that are obviously different when you actually view them, right? Like, these are yours, but then there's other artists that
mhm,
have different versions of that, and sort of the conversations that happen there, and the sort of conversations around those pictures, right? Like,
totally. And I've got
yeah,
some images of those.
yeah.
So if we go ahead to exactly what you're saying, Rachel, is eventually what happened is um, I well, I guess I'll go back and just to say, in this image, when this image was shown, a writer described my friend James as my assistant setting up
Mm,
my camera. When
mm,
factually, one can interpret but factually, there are two cameras. You can see the camera that I'm making this image with. And he is setting up his own camera, which is a Rolleiflex medium for my camera. Like, anyone who knows anything about photography knows that this image did not come from this camera.
right.
Anyways, so I started thinking about, as all of this work was getting made, of finding a place to show the work as not my work, but I wanted to pull together an exhibition, ideally like a group show organized by me, of work by all of these friends, where it could be actually contextualized as these are works made alongside mine. So this
Mhm.
was what was presented at the Whitney Biennial in 2019. It's funny because still, even with wall labels with everyone's name, like this is Giancarlo Montes Santangelo's work, this is Peter Tomka's work, this is A.L. Steiner's work, this is James Garcia's work, people still walked through and were like, Paul, that's great work. And I was like, these are not my
Yeah, they're like,
pictures.
it's not just me, I promise.
But it was, I, I, I think part of that is just, in a group show, it's hard to contextualize like a group show within a group show.
Hmm.
um and there's sort of this force of like claiming author, like singular authorship, like this is Dicko Chan, this is Emerson Ricard, this is Derek Woods Morrow, and this is Clifford Prince King, and this was the one work of mine in this show. So
I'm talking to David or Derek Woods tomorrow.
oh,
We have a
amazing.
we have a studio visit. I'm excited.
Oh yeah, he's great. He's in
He'll be
New
at
Orleans,
Bemis
right?
this summer, actually.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's amazing. Yeah, I love it. So this gets to sort of the last part, is just this, just acknowledging the photographer studio as a stage. But even before I was in this particular space where I've been in for the last 4 years in Los Angeles, even when I was making photographs in my kitchen and bedroom in Brooklyn 15 years ago, those, I think anything with repeated use becomes a platform, becomes a stage. This work only kind of like re-emphasizes it.
Yeah.
But there's, so within these, and this is where the title drop scene comes from, was thinking about the backdrop as the drop scene is the thing that comes down, that separates the performers from the audience and allows for a changing of scene to happen, or of a or whatever's going to be happening on stage behind it, and then it comes up again. So I began thinking about this work where the fabric kind of parts at its center. So these are the most recent ones, just to
And
for
this
the
is
sake of
that one is in our show.
these ones.
Yeah. The
Yeah.
what? Yeah.
Oh yeah.
This one.
and,
Yeah.
and we
Like,
and we come back to, again, the cell phone here
yeah.
with Victor, you know um and also a lot of these, it's like you can go through like work from the past 2 decades and you'll find these subjects like repeated over and
Hmm.
over again. So I'll
Yeah,
just
I wanted to ask you about that sort of thinking, about like continually photographing your friends, um, and
Mhm.
just sort of like has the dynamic changed at all through the years? You know, are they, yeah, I don't know. It's obviously this is like a personal thing that happens between the two of you or the three of you, or whoever's, there at the time. But I'm always just like curious and like, oh, like,
Yeah.
are they more like, into it, or is it sort of this thing that just like, is sort of naturally happens now, or I don't know.
Well, it's interesting, the earliest work, there's some, before I think any artist can like, I'm just gonna go through images while talking.
Yeah, no, that's great.
I think any artist can sort of relate. It's like when you're starting your first projects and you're like, you're like asking favors of your friends to sit for you. It's like neither of you know what the final product will be, how things will turn out. There's one type of sort of like trust there, right? And kind of like risk taking. And then the thing that happened, and this is why I showed the work in the context of traveling on channels in the internet and also through zines, is eventually the work, like those Truman Capote portraits, sort of travels faster than people can. And so there's this thing where people become quite notorious through images, and you literally walk in the room and people know who you are. People have seen you at all, in all kinds of weird circumstances, of how they encounter these things. And so then there is kind of like, you can't help but be very aware of the eventual audience. And so that then this is where the stage comes in. Sometimes then the work itself becomes a stage that some people want to enter into. They seek out being part of images. And then there are many people who are more private and don't want to be a part of this type of circulation. I have many friends who I'm close with who are very shy and I don't have portraits of. I have one, dear friend, we made portraits years ago, and she has asked that they never circulate. She's withdrawn all of her images, not just mine, from even the internet, ungoogleable,
Yeah.
And so that's something that's happened. But also, I was giving a talk at UC Riverside like 2 years ago, and a student asked a really good question. It's just like, well, how has the power dynamic changed in the work? And this is something that I think is important, particularly, around why I wanted to be as ethical and considerate around the Whitney presentation as possible, because part of that misascribing of the agency and the authorship of my friend's work that was made alongside me, to assigning it to me rather than them, was something that happened when there was like an anxiety from several like people who buy artwork of what was the work that was supposed to be valuable to them, and so there's this, I'm really interested in complicating that, of questioning that, but also realizing that, all of these sort of like forces, like who has access to what platforms, all these things. I don't have a resolution to them, but yeah, it's a good question. Also, one thing I want to say is, in the context of the St. Louis show, that was the first time that those earlier portraits were ever shown in an exhibition proper. And so it was important for me to go back, and particularly a few of the people who I had lost touch with, to reach out to them and let them know and ask their opinion before that work was shown. Because in 2005 or 2008, when those works were made, nothing went further than a few blocks in Brooklyn,
Right.
or maybe the internet. And so we hadn't anticipated the ways in which those things. So I think an ongoing conversation is important. This is the last slide. I guess.
Yeah, I was going to say, if anyone has any questions, like, please feel free to chat them in. I actually wanted to ask a question, since I'm sitting in a studio actually at Bemis doing this talk, and I was thinking back to, I can't remember if it was your Modern Art Notes or something, an interview about your residency in Woodstock, and sort of that's when the work prints started kind of making their way into your work. And I just wanted to maybe ask you, obviously you did the Woodstock residency in Studio Museum, which is a little different because it's not really sort of like a live workspace. And Rauschenberg, like the sort of the effect of residencies on your space, as opposed to now where you're, you obviously have your studio, where you go to obviously when you can with
That's
COVID, but
I'll actually go back to a couple of images from the Studio Museum. Yeah, so the Center for Photography at Woodstock residency was the first time that I thought about the space as a place where multiple things could happen at a time. I'd actually done a residency before that at Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, and I used it like many photographers do. It was like an office. I like went out into the world and I made photographs, and then I had some portfolio boxes and a file cabinet and my iMac or something,
yeah.
and a few things on the wall. There was one picture that I took there on April 14th, 2010.
That's my birthday.
Oh, wow. And that was the first picture like this, of just all the stuff piled up. And that's what I took with me, that sort of like lingering thing, like, oh, what is this? And this is the strategy that I took with me to the Studio Museum, or to Woodstock, and then the Studio Museum. And the Studio Museum, because it was in New York and I was already in New York, I just invited my friends uptown and we just took portraits. But since then, during residencies, I don't make photographs. I've used them as time to edit, to organize. And when I was at Lightwork in Syracuse and at the Rauschenberg residency, I used all of this type of outtakes and scraps and printout stuff to make some physical collages. So yeah, it always gets to a funny thing, like people ask about residencies and I'm like, well, I'm not going to go to make photographs. So you better be okay.
Well, yeah, I mean,
something else will happen.
Obviously, Bemis is one of the places where we're like, you can do whatever you want. There are no expectations. And I think as, a residency director, I think it's really great to be able to say that to an artist. Like you don't have to produce anything. You can, research, you can organize, you can watch movies. Like this is your time. This is your space for your practice to really, grow and morph. But okay, we have a question from Grace. How do you view the camera in your works? Is it a tool, medium, portal, or do you consider it as a subject as well?
Oh, it's all of those things. It's a tool. I mean, the initial, going back to so if I don't have the early portraits, so I'll just go to like the more recent portraits, like I don't, I would say that the camera is a tool. The camera is a tool, and I think it's been important for me, particularly, quite early with the original portraits, of realizing what it was that I was attempting to ask or to get from the images. I mean, cameras produce, if you use them in a certain way, very technically precise, very gratifying, very sort of like, you can almost like hold on to it type of an image, which I don't think is a type of fact. I think it's a fiction of a type of certainty, particularly when making portraits of people or within situations. Basically, I thought I could make portraits back in 2004 to 2007 that would sort of like concretely help me like identify and make sense of friendships, relationships, acquaintances, that it would help me pin things down. And these also coincided with a whole series of family portraits and work that I haven't even gotten into. But I quickly realized that the camera as a tool didn't give the definitive answer, but it just produced a third thing that that alongside the ways in which images circulated and there was an economy around them, produced more complications. So quickly the camera was not a tool for solving something, but it was a tool that I still was using, and I just had to actually start making work about the resulting things, not the actual photographs. So that's another thing. It is another character, because the way in which the tripod enters in, is like a stand-in. I also forgot to mention a residency in Chicago at the Hyde Park Art Center, and one at the Fire Island Artist Residency. Those were 2013 and 2014, where the tripod itself became a character, a stand-in. And that was, that's not something unique to me. Many photographers have like had that, for me, it was this moment of having set up my camera on a tripod, taking it off the tripod, sort of like been observing the space and then turning around and sort of like catching the tripod, almost like seeing your reflection in a mirror. It's sort of like pinned down this point. So it's been a stand-in and also like a formal, for works like this, or the collages. If I go up, to here is a formal structure onto which I can create compositions, So this is the reflection of the tripod. This is the surface of the mirror. Sometimes people think that the collage is on the tripod. It's not. We're seeing the reflection collapse, but it provides a formal structure.
I kind of love that. I mean, I know that you're like not trying to trick, but I think that, like, I think I realized that much later that it's like, oh, it's not on the tripod, it's actually on the mirror. But I love that sort of is, again, creating a different, like more space in between the collage and the tripod, and it's, a tripod has legs, right? Like it is sort of a body in a sense. So I definitely think it's a character for sure, as is the mirror in a way for me, like, especially as it, as it ages, as it has more dust, as it has more smudges, it sort of, it changes, it alters, as the surroundings of it alters too with you and your subjects. Okay, we had another question. You discussed how images circulate, and I'm curious how their circulation in the commercial art market, about their circulation in the commercial art market, and if that has changed the meaning of the objects or how they're made. That's from Jared, our exhibitions manager.
Yeah. That's a good question. So there's a couple of kinds of, there's sort of two things that makes me think of. One is the way in which when certain things enter into a commercial trend, there's like a revisionist history for the sake of, people want everything to sort of be new or to be like the latest thing or whatever, So, I was making work for a good 13 years or so before there was any kind of like commercial recognition for anything. And then when that happened with one particular kind of work, there was almost an interesting kind of like erasure of everything that came before it. When these initial mirror studies came out, it was sort of like erasing all the portraiture that came beforehand. And so there was a really important need for me for like a really concerted effort to, whenever topics of the work came up, of reinforcing the fact that all of this has a foundation in portraiture. And so, that's one thing. I don't know how blunt or like commercially, whatever, like oftentimes people are like, oh, don't talk about like how the sausage is made. But like, honestly, portraiture is not something that is like the most commercially viable thing. It takes a lot to say first, so it's, to be totally blunt, images that do not have a portrait at its center are the things that are more commercially easy or accessible, right? So there's this kind of like conundrum. Portraiture circulates in a type of a way, but it is still, I had years ago, when I first got to know Jack Pearson, he was like a mentor when I was young, and I remember him telling me, he was like, everyone knows Jack Pearson's portraits, but he's like, it's the scribbles that sell. It's the it's the other things. Portraiture circulates in one type of world on our cell phones. That's the thing that you put a portrait, people are going to give you, it's just like something absent a figure doesn't have that function. And I think it's a really interesting kind of thing. Also, I'm when it comes to circulation of portraiture on social media, I'm kind of, I've almost sort of like withdrawn from circulating portraits I make of other people,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm interested in the ways in which they might circulate them. I
Mm-hmm.
hope I answered that question.
I think you did, but maybe maybe
Yeah.
Jared has other thoughts, but
And like, I hope like
I just keep thinking
directors or
about
gals start
yeah,
listening.
I just keep thinking about the earlier works, the how you found your images on Tumblr, and like sort of thinking through like
Oh
life,
yeah,
like Tumblr is, you know, is like pre-Instagram, right? And sort of
yeah.
the I just had so many Tumblrs that I would follow, and like I just loved
Mhm.
that like influx of images. And it's like I totally understand where Instagram came from now that I'm like thinking about it that way. And
Yeah.
um
Like these things have circulated so much more. I have
mhm,
thousands and thousands and thousands of these in like folders. There was like one summer when I had total like artist block and I couldn't make anything, and I just started going down every rabbit hole looking for every retumble. And this, I just, for an entire maybe 6 months, I just tracked this stuff down. This work has circulated in a way, but I will tell you, I have 99.9% of all of the portraits that I've ever made still in my studio.
wow, that's amazing. Amazing.
Or they're with friends.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Interesting.
Sorry. I say too
Well,
much. I should not be saying these things.
um, well, I think we're you know, we're a little past time, and it seems like this is a good spot to stop. But I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. Everyone on YouTube Live that joined us as well. Thank you so much, Paul. This
Yeah.
was super fun. And thank you, obviously, to the staff at Bemis, and also at Document and Vielmetter for helping make the show. It's really like so wonderful, Paul. I'm so sad that you can't be here to see it.
I know.
But if you're, you know, if anyone's around, please come by and spend some time here. So yeah, and join us for our next program. So
Yeah, thank you. Thank you,
thank
Rachel,
you.
for putting this together. It's been a pleasure.
Yes, it has. It really has. All right, everyone, have a wonderful rest of your day.
Great.
Bye.
Bye.